Thousands of flat-bottomed boats moved quickly through the rough seas under cold, gray skies. As the vessels moved toward the beaches, the smell of diesel fumes and vomit was overwhelming. The water slapped hard against the wooden hulls, while bullets dinged the flat steel bows. Terrified soldiers cowered beneath the gunwales, sheltering from the never-ceasing enemy fire. Suddenly, they heard the sound of the boat's bottoms hitting the sand and stone. Giant iron rams dropped into the sea, and the men surged forward through the cold water toward an uncertain fate. It was 6:28 a.m. on June 6, 1944, and the first LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle, and personnel, had just landed on Utah Beach at Normandy. D-Day and the Allied invasion of Europe had begun. By the early 1940s, the war was reaching its climax. Victories in Sicily, North Africa, and at the Battle of Stalingrad spelled the end for the Nazi regime. One last push was needed. Then, on June 6th, celebrated as D-Day, the Allies began a massive invasion of Europe, landing some 156,000 British, Canadian, and American soldiers on the beaches at Normandy, France. To successfully carry out this complex infiltration, otherwise known as Operation Overlord, new and revolutionary technology was necessary. Enter the Higgins boat. Andrew Higgins developing the Higgins boat introduced a new age of groundbreaking wartime innovation, initiating a technological revolution in amphibious and mobile warfare and prompting a change to war as we know it. Andrew Higgins was born on August 28, 1886. He grew up in Nebraska as the youngest child with his mother and father. During these years, Higgins was expelled from multiple schools for fighting. This aggressive temperament continued to manifest even through adulthood. He was once quoted saying about his shipyard, "Anybody caught stealing tools out of this yard won't get fired. He'll go to the hospital." Anyway, it was clear Higgins needed somewhere else to divert his energy. The young boy soon found out that he had a passion for boats. They would improve his overall temperament when he was around them. When Higgins was 12, he built his first vessel in the basement of his house. It was so large, a wall of his house had to be torn down to get it out. Other than this incident, he had a relatively average childhood. A Life magazine article from 1942 summed up his early years. Two things seem almost certain. Higgins was interested in boats at a very young age, and he fought at the drop of a hat. After a stint in the Nebraska National Guard in 1906, Higgins moved down south to work in the lumber industry. During his life in lumber, he hadn't thought much about boats until a tract of lumber in shallow water required him to build a vessel. Once again realizing his passion for boats, Higgins signed up for a naval architecture course, which featured coursework in marine and offshore structure design, thermodynamics, and ocean engineering practices. With these essential skills in his pocket, his journey as a World War II hero began. The Higgins boat was created soon after Andrew moved to New Orleans, where he created his boat manufacturing company. This was in the late 1930s. His company designed shallow water workboats for similar situations to his lumber story. Some sources say that Higgins planned for his boats to be used by trappers and oil drillers. A few even claim that his business's main income revolved around selling boats to liquor smugglers. Higgins soon encountered financial difficulties, and his association with the U.S. military occurred around the time Prohibition was repealed, which would have ruined his market in the rum-running sector. The U.S. Navy's interest in the boats was in any case great news for Higgins. Higgins was later signed to a contract with the U.S. Coast Guard to develop boats that were used to chase and catch rum runners. Higgins worked for the Coast Guard until Pearl Harbor was bombed.
The United States Marine Corps, preparing for what they knew would be a long and difficult war, began looking for new ways to get men across the beach in an amphibious landing. Frustrated by a lack of progress from the Bureau of Construction and Repair, the Navy began expressing interest in the Higgins boats. "The man was all about efficiency and getting things done," said Joshua Schick, a curator at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The Navy began to realize that if there was an impossible task, they could just give it to Higgins and he'd do it. In particular, General Victor H. Krulak believed Higgins had a lot of potential. He showed Higgins a picture of the Daihatsu-class landing craft, a ramp-bow landing boat used by the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The boats had come under fierce scrutiny by the Navy at the Battle of Shanghai. When Krulak presented Higgins with a picture of the boat and suggested that Higgins develop a version of this craft for the Navy, Higgins created 3 at his own expense. Higgins' boat, tested in 1938, performed much better than the Navy-made boats. The Marine Corps brought it back for the fleet landing exercises in February 1939, where it had another exemplary performance. It only had one major drawback. Men and equipment had to unload over the sides of the craft, exposing them to enemy fire and making loading and unloading time-consuming and complicated. However, it was the best boat available at the time, and was put into production services later that year. By October 1940, it was being supplied to the British. On May 26, 1941, Commander Ross Daggett of the Coast Guard and Major Ernest Lyndhurst of the Marine Equipment Board witnessed the testing of the craft. After these two officials agreed, Andrew Higgins started formally producing boats for the Navy. By September 1943, 12,964 of the American Navy's 14,072 vessels had been designed by Higgins Industries. Essentially 92% of the U.S. Navy consisted of Mr. Higgins boats. However, the most famous use of the boat was yet to come. June 6, 1944. Most of Europe was under German control. This was all about to change when the Higgins boat opened doors that allowed the Allies to penetrate the German defenses. This was the largest scale amphibious attack known to man, D-Day. The invasion was an effort to retake Europe from the Germans and the Italians. The idea was referred to as Operation Overlord. Troops were trained to use the Higgins boat and operate in the frigid conditions. The invasion was located in Normandy, France, in 5 different divisions spread out along the length of the beach for maximum effectiveness. This is where the Higgins boat became crucial.
The propeller systems allowed the boats to move into water 10 inches deep. This created the ability for the boats to reach the shore undetected by the enemy. The system allowed for the divisions to land close enough to the beach for the army to unload and swarm the beach with Allied troops. This amphibious landing effectiveness was unheard of at the time. The capacity of the boats was also a main cause in the success of the battle. In fact, Higgins boats put more men and equipment on the beach than did all other types of boats combined. Higgins' creation had a dramatic impact on the outcome of Normandy landing 75 years ago, as well as many other naval operations in World War II. The vessel's unique design, coupled with the inventor's dogged determination to succeed, may very well have swung the balance of victory to within the grasp of the Allies. At least, that's what President Dwight D. Eisenhower believed. Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us, he told author Stephen Ambrose in a 1964 interview. Higgins developed a reputation for being able to do the impossible. Once the Navy asked him if he could come up with plans for a new boat design in 3 days. "Hell," he replied, "I can build a boat in 3 days." And that is exactly what he did. Many believe the secret to Higgins' success was his personality. He was an incredibly driven man, and he never let barriers slow him down. He often pushed his way through or over bureaucratic hurdles, labor problems, or material shortages with his brusque attitude. As long as Higgins was the one in charge and didn't have to rely on other people, he could bust through any obstacle that came his way, Schick said. That attitude of determination and hard work helped him solve just about any issue. The Higgins boat was used in many other amphibious landings throughout World War II. In addition to Normandy, they were used in Sicily, Anzio, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan, Okinawa, Peleliu, and many other beaches in the European and Pacific theaters of operation. A former advisor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Raymond Moley, wrote in a 1943 Newsweek article that Higgins' assembly line for small boats broke precedents, but it is Higgins himself who takes your breath away as much as his remarkable products and his fantastic ability to multiply his products at headlong speed. Higgins is an authentic master builder, with a kind of willpower, brains, drive, and daring that characterized the American empire builders of an earlier generation. The boat's legacy, and that of the inventor, cannot be understated. They changed the trajectory of the war and gave the Allies the ability to attack anywhere with astounding speed and effectiveness. In fact, they were so important that Higgins was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in
May of 2019 to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. His contribution to America was so momentous that even the 34th President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, claimed that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different.